Welcome to another great week on the Ari Goldkind Show on Sirius XM, Canada Talks Channel 167. What a show we have for you this week. This is really the top to me of the news cycle right now. We are going to have Jon Kay, the writer, podcaster, editor of Quillette, who helped break the story about the anti-racism grifter, Laith Marouf, the Jew hater, the anti-Semite, the one who calls Jews bags of feces. Jon Kay, with the assistance of another gentleman, broke that story. It's the only reason you may know about it now. The story would have been buried, but for Jon Kay, where this piece of garbage grifter making off with $100,000+ of taxpayer money. And tonight, Jon Kay and I are going to dig into it. We're going to dig into the story, how it came to his attention, how it came to be. It's a conversation you are not going to want to miss. And we are going to talk to Jon for the entire hour of the show after my opening monologue. And I think you're going to find it a very, very interesting conversation. And I can assure you that it's a conversation that is long overdue. And there are probably going to be some points where Jon and I disagree on certain things. I think this is a very interesting story. I believe anti-Semitism, anti-Jew hate is really at the top of a very short list of hate in this country. We're constantly told this is a hateful country. We're told it's filled with racialized people, as if that's a word or a verb that describes something being done to somebody, rather than a country that bends over backwards as the most welcoming country in the world and does extraordinarily generous things for people of all races, particularly people who are recent immigrants to Canada. So Jon and I are going to talk Laith Marouf. We're going to talk the significance of it. We're going to talk about anti-Semitism baked into the far left, the Liberal Party, the NDP. And it's a conversation, as I said, you're not going to want to miss. As I said at the top of the show, there's also going to be an opening statement. Let's get to it right now. Justin Trudeau has now come out yesterday commenting publicly about Chrystia Freeland's 14 seconds of hell. You probably know what I'm talking about. That story has become the bogeyman du jour, the Lisa LaFlamme story of this week, now that the Lisa LaFlamme story has died down, as all huge rage-causing stories die down. And Justin Trudeau came out and said a couple of things today, that there's no place for threats and hate and harassment and vile talk in this country that he runs with 31% of the vote. It's interesting that Justin Trudeau, who's been tweeting, talking, giving press conferences about Chrystia Freeland's 14 seconds of hell, by the way, 14 seconds that are abhorrent, that keep people from running for office, where just the dynamics of some big, huge dude sort of scaring Chrystia Freeland unaccompanied or with one person, the optics of that are terrible. And that moronic dude who yells at her, he makes his cause look way worse, much crazier, much more threatening, and he gives credence to that far-right white supremacy garbage and nonsense. So from a tactical point of view, what that moron in Calgary did to Chrystia Freeland is just stupid. But let's get to the fallout of it, as if that's the biggest thing to happen to Canada in 50 years. Back to the point at hand. Justin Trudeau, wasting no opportunity to get out there and provide his bona fide feminist credentials, comes out and says that 14 seconds is abhorrent. It's not Canada. It should be called out. It should be censored. It should be erased. It should be censured. You name the word. Have you seen any tweet or public speech on camera where Justin Trudeau has come out and called Laith Marouf a piece of garbage? No, you haven't. And you probably won't, because there's no constituency for him to come out and say that. He'll probably say something in print where the comments are vile or they're not Canadian. But could you imagine the haste that Justin Trudeau would have come out and said something if somebody said something about Laith Marouf's group or religion or background? Or if there was a fake hijab attack, the way Justin Trudeau and all the politicians jumped on a number of years ago, when a young girl in Toronto lied about her hijab being pulled off. Justin Trudeau knows the numbers. He knows that Jews are dying out, heavily for our own reasons, for a bunch of reasons that, we don't have enough time to talk about tonight, not because of the Holocaust from 1945, but because of certain decisions Jews are making. Birth rates. We're a dying and declining birth rate in a world where certain other religions are exponentially higher than any other. Justin Trudeau is aware of this. But the silence from him is deafening about the piece of garbage named Laith Marouf. It's just deafening from the Prime Minister, who literally would attend the opening of a door if there was an opportunity to score racialized, anti-racism, anti-hate, Islamophobic points at. He's always there. He's never too busy for that. He would fly private home from Costa Rica if somebody named Lee Goldstein had insulted Laith Marouf. But somehow Justin Trudeau has been awfully radio silent about Laith Marouf calling Jews bags of feces and other names. And isn't it interesting how many other people have been silent about what Laith Marouf did, his anti-racism grift? Isn't that interesting? Have you seen any of the usual councils or groups of certain denominations or religions or backgrounds coming out with statements condemning the Jew hatred? Of course you haven't. Have you seen any NDP MPs of a prominent nature? The anti-racism people in the NDP, the anti-racism people in the Liberals, other than Ahmed Hussein, coming out and condemning what Laith Marouf said, with taxpayer money, mind you, about Jews. Now, you might say they can't comment on every issue. They can't comment on everything happening in Canada. Is there a prominent person, whether politically or in any position of power, in the last couple of days that hasn't taken the opportunity to call out the man who scared Krista Freeland for 14 seconds in an elevator? An outlier, a unicorn, a bully of a man, an imbecile of a man, an embarrassment of a man, but not a man receiving $130,000 of Liberal and taxpayer dollars to spread anti-racism, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, Jew hatred around. All of the Conservative MPs, all of the Liberal MPs, the NDP MPs, the council of this organization, the council of that religion, they've all been silent about Laith Marouf. And why is that? The silence is deafening, and it's very, very telling, because it says something. It speaks to something. It's not by accident. When you look at the coordinated tweet storm about Krista Freeland's 14 seconds of heck, you see that nothing happens by accident in Canada. This isn't something going viral. This is people choosing to make Krista Freeland the victim of the year, but nobody choosing to make Jews or the kind of anti-Jew hatred spread by this Liberal government's crony, this tax-paying anti-racist grifter. There's a decision to be silent about that. And let's take it a step further to something even more nefarious. Marco Mendicino, the embarrassment of a public safety minister yesterday, came out and said that not only is what happened to Krista Freeland a threat to her, but it's a threat to democracy as we know it. So now you see this being ginned up in some January 6th way, that this is our new January 6th because Krista Freeland in Alberta faced an idiot near an elevator who didn't follow her into the elevator. But again, what he did was imbecilic and abhorrent, and nobody should have it. It's very simple. It keeps good people from running for office. But what do you see being discussed today as a result of this 14 seconds? One, the Liberal cabinet now is going to increase security for the Liberal government and its cabinet. Now, that would all be fine and good with me if the Liberal government wasn't actively involved in making this country far less safe. if the Liberal government wasn't creating actual policies that make crime rise, if the Liberal government wasn't catering to people who commit violent crime, and if the Liberal government wasn't, well, on one hand, giving more police and more bodyguards to cabinet or backbenchers, but saying, you, dear citizen listening to Sirius XM Canada Talks, Channel 167, when your neighbor is carjacked, we're going to take the side of the carjacker. We're going to say that person is a victim. That person has been victimized. Maybe that person is racialized. Maybe that person shouldn't go to jail because that person may be overrepresented in our jails. So it's, again, the rules for thee, but not for me. More cops for the government that makes crime rise through its policies, but less cops or less support for what police actually do. And if your mom or grandmother or brother are carjacked, well, just file a police report. The police are busy handcuffing themselves. It is utterly astounding, the hypocrisy here. But the second part of Marco Mendicino's point about the threat to democracy of this 14-second exchange with one person in Canada, and Krista Freeland, meanwhile, one of the most powerful women in the world, a victim by no stretch of the imagination, in any way, shape, or form, if you understand anything about Krista Freeland, is that the public safety minister says this is a threat to democracy. This is a man who says on the left side of his mouth that 14 seconds is a threat to democracy. But on the right side of his mouth is the guy that invokes the Emergencies Act and freezes the bank accounts of ordinary average people who want to protest lockdowns and mandates, who do not support violence, who do not support obstruction, who do not support any illegality. But this man, via Krista Freeland as well, these threats to democracy that you, the listener, are, he says the 14 seconds is the threat to democracy, but the freezing of bank accounts with no due process, less due process, I emphasize, less due process than tax evaders, tax cheats, money launderers, drug dealers, and terrorists get more due process. Marco Mendicino literally, and you should watch the clip, says that the man who confronted Krista Freeland in that hallway in Alberta before she got into the elevator is the threat to democracy. How anybody can say that with a straight face, looking at themselves in Zoom, and not really reflect on them being the threat to democracy, democracy being free to criticize, complain, or protest the government in power, is a hypocrisy that continues to know no bounds. Back in 2 minutes with Jon Kay, we will talk anti-Semitism, anti-Jew hatred, and the grifter, Laith Marouf. Welcome back to the Ari Goldkind Show on Sirius XM, Canada Talks, Channel 167. I'm joined by podcaster, writer, and editor at Quillette, which is an incredible website run by incredible people and talking about things that are incredible with the very nature of the term not believable when you think of incredible. Jon Kay is my guest. Jon, great to have you on.
How are you?
I'm great, and I want to start and I want to get right into this issue of, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Laith Marouf. I talked about him at the top of the show and why I wanted to have you on, but why don't we, as we get into it, give me your sense of the story, what the story's about, and then we'll get into some questions.
So I think probably among your listeners and viewers, everyone's familiar with the fact that there are there are nuts everywhere, right? Including anti-Semitic nuts. It's not, that in itself is not a news story. We live in a country of 38 million people. A few of them are going to be haters. The reason Laith Marouf, that story is interesting is this is an out and proud anti-Semite who for several years has managed to be on the government payroll. He was, I think, a consultant, I forget which capacity with the CRTC. And then he got this really sweet deal through the Anti-Racism Fund at Canadian Heritage to teach broadcasters like yourself, actually, and maybe I
Right.
guess myself, about
The
anti-racism.
errors of my ways.
Well, I mean, this was literally his mandate.
Yeah.
He was going to go on, I think, a 6. I've seen it described as a 5 or a 6 city tour, of which he's already done 2 cities, by the way, where he was going to do town halls with broadcasters and instruct them in the ways of anti-racism. And this is a guy, I don't know how much you said in your introduction, but this is a guy who is like, I mean, often the term anti-Semitism is used loosely. Sometimes it's used to describe things that I don't think are really anti-Semitic, but
Right.
this guy's the real deal. Like, he's just
Okay, so let's get to that, because I think, and just to be fair, this guy is a virulent anti-Jew. I don't even like the word anti-Semitic. He is a Jew hater of the highest order. To me, if he was around in 1943, he would have walked my grandparents and great-grandparents right into the chambers. He's unabashed about it. His lawyer made ridiculous comments, walking it back. The point is, he's received at least a couple $100,000. He is virulently anti-Semitic, but he has been rewarded. And John, this is the premise of one of the things I wanted to talk to you about tonight. He is the literal epitome of, in the last 5 to 10 years, what I call a racial grifter, making hundreds of thousands of money, I think, with Gretchen King, who I believe he's connected to or married to, with this scam where the only group that you can legitimately go after in this country are Jews. If you flip this over and he had said these sort of things about Black people, Muslims, Asians, this would have been toast years ago. How did this come to you? Why are you the one writing about this, not the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star? I have my suspicions, but I'd like to get into the weeds with you because you've done such an important thing here.
So I answer that question, although I would push back a little bit on the idea that the only people you can say this about are Jews. I think this guy Laith Marouf is smart to the extent that he has read the tea leaves when it comes to the current political atmosphere, and he structures a lot of his so-called anti-racism activism around the idea of indigenous peoples more broadly, which of course he he describes the Palestinians as being indigenous. And for years now, I've actually looked at some of his writings going back, I think, to 2010, where he's appeared at conferences and in his government grant applications. He works very hard to try and cast his quite vicious anti-Israeli rhetoric in the context of like, oh, I'm a champion of Turtle Island, whether it's Turtle Island in Canada or sort of like the indigenous version of the Palestinian version of Turtle Island in Israel. And so a lot of this has to do with him kind of marketing his stuff in light of the general political movement that casts, I would say, non-indigenous people as bad, or at least suspect, or settlers, or what have you, and indigenous people being good. And he's kind of glommed onto that in regard to the Palestinian issue. So he's kind of been very, until now, I guess, clever about marketing himself. He needed to learn to shut up about his anti-Semitism, which he couldn't do apparently. And then so for months and months and months, he lost at least one Twitter account, but he has some new Twitter account, which I think is still active, although he's protected on Twitter, where he made dozens, hundreds of horrifying tweets, and not just about Jews, by the way, about French people, who he's always calling them frogs. He went to Washington a couple of months ago and took a picture of himself at the Vietnam War Memorial, giving the finger to the memorial and saying that he wished millions more US soldiers had died in that conflict. And no one was talking about this except for this guy named Mark Goldberg, who I know about from Twitter. He gained some public following because he was the organizer of a well-known, I think, broadcast technology conference a few years back. And you know, he has a couple of thousand followers on his Twitter account, and he was always tweeting this stuff about Laith Marouf, who I knew Laith Marouf from his crazy activist days at Concordia University 20 years ago. And I was looking at Mark Goldberg's screenshots, and I was like, this can't be true. Like, this guy is an anti-racism consultant that being paid out by the Department of Heritage, Canadian Heritage, under their anti-racism program. Like, it doesn't make sense. But Mark sent over this like huge trove of screenshots. Yeah, I was looking at it. I said, this is crazy. And again, it isn't some random nut. It's a guy who,
He's
well,
being paid by us, John. That's why this story interests me. He's being,
yeah,
I
one
mean,
hundred
if
thirty
you
thousand
take the
dollars.
view that the taxpayer is you, me, and every hardworking person listening to this and throughout this country, the premise of this, which makes it interesting, is this is not a nut in his basement. This
No,
is somebody from the days of Concordia. His anti-Jewishness, forget the Israel, I think that gives people a pass. His anti-Jewishness has literally given him a very successful career, but with hundreds of thousands of dollars paid for by Canadians. That's the part of the story that fascinates me.
yeah, and to be fair, so we're having this conversation on Tuesday, August 23rd. Yesterday, on Monday, August 22nd, after I'd been tweeting about it for over a week, and Mark Goldberg had been tweeting about this for I don't know how many months, the federal government, the Liberals, finally pulled the plug on this guy and announced that they were canceling this guy's contract. So,
And I will have questions for you about that.
yeah, I mean, it's amazing that it took that long, but it shows you how successful his grift was for this period.
And
Yeah.
and that's the word that I use, John, is that, one of the things I've done in my monologues throughout this show is I say quite openly that the people who claim to be the victims in this world are often the victimizers. The people who claim to have no power are the ones actually in positions of
Could I
power.
just make a point about Marouf personally?
Sure.
Um, so when he became known in Montreal as this student hothead at Concordia, he was I think he was VP internal at the Concordia Student Union
Yeah.
in 2001, which is when his name became known. At the time of his arrest, because for reasons we could get into them, but he was
Yeah. And I
actually,
saw those charges were dropped. Yeah.
yeah, although he not before he tried to claim diplomatic immunity on the basis that his father was a diplomat from Syria.
Well,
Like, at the
that's
time,
some chutzpah.
well, yeah, I mean, especially in this age when we talk about privilege. He was a very privileged guy in that at the time, at least, he was a Syrian citizen. He came from Syria. His dad was a Syrian diplomat. Tried to claim diplomatic immunity. As I understand, he has now become a Canadian citizen, although in the various podcasts he's done with Russian propaganda outlets, because he has this sideline doing interviews with things like Sputnik News and stuff, he describes himself as living in Lebanon. So he's a guy in Lebanon. He's now a Canadian citizen. Putting aside all the horrible things he says, I don't know how he's been living in Lebanon for at least 3 years, according to his own pronouncements, how that guy is getting money to teach Canadian broadcasters anti-racism is a really weird thing. I mean,
So
even
that
putting,
so that's one. Okay, so let's get to it, because you mentioned Concordia, and I was reading up on this, and I live in Toronto, and I know that if you want to find anti-Jewish hatred, ground zero would be York University, a major, massive university just in the northern western part of Toronto. I know, and I saw in the later years of my university days in the late 90s, that if you wanted to find a place that foments anti-Jewish hatred, not criticism of Israel and all that bullcrap that people think gets them their get out of jail free card, it's the universities. This is somebody, to me, that but for you talking about this, John, this is why you're on. I'm not talking to somebody else. But for you talking about this man would have made hundreds of thousands of more dollars by going at and after Jews. He would never have been stopped by the government that hired him. You would never have had Ahmed Hussein, who I believe knows a lot more about this than he let on in his press release the other day, but I may be wrong on that. We'll chat about that. But this to me, and I know you disagree, so I don't have people on here that are sycophantic or who agree with me. I believe this is a feature, not a bug, of the Liberal Party, and a number over 30 to 43 of their MPs who are unabashedly anti-Semitic, but because they're in the Liberal Party, they have to walk it back. I know for a fact this is a feature in the federal NDP, as well as very much in the provincial. How is it that this is only a problem when Jon Kay gets on the case?
Well, look, so a
lot to break down there, obviously.
Okay,
but
well, I'll stick it to 2 points. First of all, I think the Liberals wanted to ignore this because it wasn't just a question of not giving more money to this guy. Like, Laith Marouf had organized this series of town hall sessions, and at least 3 or 4 of these big anti-racism town halls were still pending. Like, as I was tweeting about this, his outfit was tweeting about this upcoming thing they have in Calgary, and they're all excited, and they had speakers lined up. Like CBC types and college professors.
Sure.
And so
the elite.
This was a huge headache for the Liberals, that like not only do we have to take the hit on this, and also if you look at the documentation back in April, the press release that Marouf that put out,
he's on it with Hussein. He's on it.
There's 2 people quoted on it, which is Marouf, because he's got some company, it's basically him and his wife that organized this speaking tour, and the one other guy on it is Minister of Diversity, Ahmed Hussein, who's talking about how proud he is of the project and how it's so great and anti-racism is so wonderful. So the whole thing is humiliating to the Liberals, and you can see why they just kind of wanted to run out the clock. It's like, okay, let this nutbag do his anti-racism conferences, and then we'll hopefully not give him any more money. But then I guess I made a big fuss about it, and I think Erwin Kotler got involved, and CIJA, some Jewish groups got involved. Senator Linda Frum got involved. Like, we talk about elites. Like, I'm very lucky. I have friends in politics and media. Jason Kenney got involved. Like, it's Mark Goldberg himself. He started, like, all credit to him. He's the guy who had the goods on Laith Marouf. But I'm a little bit of a enfant terrible on Twitter, so I was able to like get the message out. I dispute what you say about like how there's all these anti-Semites in politics. I don't agree with that. I think it's something very different. I think, especially among the Liberals and NDP, you have a bunch of people who are just absolutely terrified of being on the wrong side of any kind of flavor of the month progressive orthodoxy. And right now, the progressive orthodoxy happens to be like decolonization, indigenization, Black Lives Matter, which is like, by the way, these causes aren't necessarily bad causes. Like, some of them, I support certain elements of some of those causes. But the fact of the matter is, it's very easy, as I just discussed previously, to take, say, indigenization or decolonization. These are mantras that are extremely faddish. They're extremely popular in the context of Canadian progressive politics. With a few subtle word changes, it's very possible to adapt these hashtag movements toward a vilification of Israel, and in Laith Marouf's case, by extension, Jews.
Right.
So, but to me, this isn't like just the Liberals and NDP are full of virulent anti-Semites. I don't think that's true. I reject that, because I know there's some people on Twitter who are like, this proves that Trudeau's an anti-Semite. I don't think Trudeau's an anti-Semite. I think
I'm not talking about Trudeau, just to be clear. But if you look at some of the votes and the Hansard records of certain votes and who abstains and who doesn't show up and who mysteriously the dog eats their homework on certain days, it's always a certain segment of the Liberal and NDP party who stay home. And I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's been a series of high-profile votes, and it always happens to be the people most renowned for hating Jews and hating Israel, which are not mutually exclusive. So you can say it's maybe a coincidence. I think
they're terrified of. I think these are people who are terrified of alienating any of their constituents.
All right, well, that's fair enough. But okay, that's fair. So let me ask you this: that's fair. They're worried about alienating their constituency
or part of their constituency. I don't want to say that like they have one constituency.
No, but hold on. That's a very fine point. My concern, whether it be as a Jew or as a citizen, is that the constituency of people who hate Jews and hate Israel, or lump those in or separate them out with some false ideological garbage, the constituency for that kind of philosophy, that kind of idea, is much greater given demographics, immigration, demographic change than Jon Kay and Ari Goldkind. So even if you and I disagree on my pretense or my pretext, there is a lot to be gained voting wise by being anti-Israel or anti-Semitic, and nothing to lose. Now, would you disagree with that based on demographics?
I totally disagree.
So tell me why, based on numbers, just pure numbers of populations in Canada.
So, well, I mean, let's just use plain language. You're talking about Muslims, right?
I never use words. I leave it for people to infer.
Okay. I infer that you are talking about Muslims.
Okay.
And you are referring to the idea that there's more Muslims than Jews in Canada, and that immigration policy is such that the Muslim share of the population is going to rise, and the Jewish population share proportionately is not going to keep up.
Sinking like a stone.
Look, I see people, I mean, for 20 years, I've seen stuff like this. And especially after 9/11, there was this like great wave of fear mongering, especially in Europe, not as much in Canada, but in Europe, that was like, you know, the Islamification of Europe, and Muslims have like 17 kids and all this stuff. And like, I mean, a lot of this really was like very as Islamophobic. There was genuine, legitimate concern over radicalism in the Islamic community, and that concern remains valid. However, my observation on social media and in my peer groups, the people I meet, the journalism I read, is that I actually see a disgust with radicalization among many Canadian Muslims. Many Canadian Muslims I meet on social media are some of my biggest allies when it comes to pushing back on censorship and excessive wokeness.
Okay, John, I think nobody, because we have to take a break and we'll come back and let you pick up on that. I don't think anybody disputes that. Jon Kay has friends. Ari Goldkind has friends. There are many in every religion and race that would be outliers or reject certain things. I accept that.
I don't think they're outliers.
Well, I mean, look, but fair enough. But let's take a quick break. We're on the Ari Goldkind Show with Jon Kay, podcaster, writer, editor at Quillette. We'll be right back after a quick break. Don't go anywhere. Back in 2 minutes, and we'll let John continue with that answer. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the Ari Goldkind Show on Sirius XM, Canada Talks, channel 167. We're talking with Jon Kay, who's done some really brave reporting, picking up on the passion of another gentleman, bringing it to light and getting real results at the highest level of government. John, just before we took the break, you were pushing back a little bit on the premise that, there's a certain religion out there that's a big fan of Israel, big supporter of Jews. You know people who reject radical this, so do I. I never like to spend time on that because there's always people each one of us knows. But in a general sense, do you get the sense, maybe I'll ask it in a different way because you've really looked at Laith Marouf. Do you believe he's an outlier?
Yeah.
And he's a unicorn, and there aren't a number or a great number of thousands, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands who share his views?
There might be hundreds of thousands in Canada. I mean, are there people in Canada who go around obsessing about
just sharing his views, not obsessing, going about their work, working away, raising their family, but if push come to shove under a polygraph examination, that they support or are tolerant of his views and would not shun him out for having them?
There very well may be tens or even hundreds of thousands of people like that. And I mean, to speak bluntly, it's entirely possible that many of them are Muslims. I take a different view on this, is that I want to say I don't care, but I really hate entering the realm of like thought crime. And there are plenty of immigrant communities who come to Canada. They're Hindus and they don't like Muslims, or they're Muslims and they don't like Hindus, or they're Sikhs and they're Khalistanis, or they're Hutus and they don't like Tutsis, and they're Tutsis and they don't like Hutus, Armenians and Turks, Macedonians, Greeks, like go down the list. And it is entirely possible that, my neighborhood is teeming with people who have these vestigial hatreds. And you know what? Human beings are tribal people. And if they keep these hatreds to themselves and they don't try and pass them on to the next generation and they don't act on them, that's their business. And like, I think if we had this conversation, Ari, like 10 or 15 years ago, I'd be much more willing to say, oh yeah, this is like, we have to root, we need to make sure that like Muslims, uh, at the mosque, like they get up and they say, they renounce this stuff and they renounce this and they renounce that. I think over the last 10 or 15 years, we've had a pretty good look at what this renunciation culture looks like, where it's like you have to renounce your whiteness and renounce your settler colonial guilt
Yeah,
and
it's
all that
horse
stuff.
manure.
Well, yeah, and it's actually given me a different position on some of the things that I was very dogmatic about previously, where like, when I was at the National Post writing these editorials like Muslims must do this and Muslims do, it's like, wait a sec. Muslim Canadians have the same responsibility of everybody else in Canada, including Jewish Canadians. They have a responsibility to abide by the law. And from a moral point of view, yeah, I appreciate if like they're public decision makers, or they run companies or they're employers or as educators or something like that. If you happen to have parochial or even bigoted attitudes about this or that group, the same whether you're a member of any other group, keep it out of the classroom, keep it out of the workplace, keep it off the dinner table, hopefully. But it's not my business to say, oh, I bet you think this. It's like people think a lot of things. You might think a lot. I might think a lot of things. And I, on Twitter, a lot of people will come after me and they say, well, you never say you hate group X, but I bet you hate group X, don't you? And it's like,
Yeah, but that's Twitter.
Well, it's not Twitter. It's a window into it. I mean, you asked me, it's you asking me this. It's like, don't you think these people like secretly believe this stuff? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. I don't think it's our job to sort
All right.
of
Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this then, because you're a deep thinker and you spend your life thinking deeply.
Not so much.
Well, I don't agree. So we'll disagree on that respectfully. I know your work. I know you're a thoughtful person and you say what you want to say. I do believe we censor ourselves. Mm-hmm. You made a point a moment ago that I want to pick up on, even though it's tangential to the Laith Marouf, which I do want to come back to because I do want to talk about Ahmed Hussein before we close. You mentioned that it's a thought crime. You don't want to police thought crime, whatever people think, whether it's hundreds of thousands of people, which you can see could think what Laith Marouf does.
Right.
We live in a culture, I'm sure you'd agree, because I've seen you write and push back on it, where this, words are violence nonsense, or, speech is violence. And, sitting on your keister and doing all this allows all these bad things to happen. As a person who happens to have a last name that I think was probably shortened at some point.
Kapitsky. It used to be Jonathan Kapitsky.
There you go. So
my name was never, this is important. My name was never Kapitsky. My dad's name was Kapitsky. He changed it before I was born.
Yes, but you get people who are listening to this in an intelligent way, they know what I'm about to say, which is, I understand that you're saying you don't want to police people's thoughts. I'm a big fan of that too. And, my view is that everybody's outdoor voice should reflect their indoor voice, and we'd have a better, more open, better dialogue, better discussion, better debate. But
I don't know about that.
No, I know. But here's my point.
I don't know about that.
When you say, well, let's say hundreds of thousands of people share what Laith Marouf think, but that's for them to think, that's for them to have at their dinner table. Do you not think, given the history of the world, given history as we've either learned it or not learned it, that there may be a danger to people with the last name Kay that's a little bit greater than you and I or Rob Ford making a joke about how hard people work? Do you not see some kind of danger, potentially, if the blank hit the fan, that there may be hundreds of thousands of people that literally would say a country should be wiped off the earth, people should be forced into the sea? That's a little bit different than a lot of the other sectarian arguments that I appreciate you're talking about, Armenianness, Orthodox, I get that. But to me, there does seem to be, if hundreds of thousands of people in Canada may think a certain thing, yes, they haven't acted on it. Yes, I'm not saying anybody can't think what they want. But do you not see perhaps a bigger existential threat in hundreds of thousands of people thinking that about somebody with the last name Kay?
Look, there's always an existential threat to Jews. Just as there will always be an existential threat to Tutsis in Rwanda and you know, to Yazidis, to Kurds in Iraq. Like and the anti-Semitism they call, God, was it 20th century's most successful ideology, I think Ruth Weiss
I've
once
never
said.
heard that, but that's a very smart line.
It's an especially virulent and hard to stamp out and enduring form of bigotry. That said, while it is the duty of anti-Semites who come to Canada with their anti-Semitism reflecting geographic, parochial disputes, or you know, maybe they come to their anti-Semitism by folk ideology or whatever,
Or just their
as
parents.
just as we expect them to be their best selves and to try and reject it, I also think it's the responsibility of people like you and me to assume the best of our neighbors and fellow Canadians, and to not assume that they harbor these horrible thoughts. When someone like Laith Marouf gives expression to them, of course we denounce it. It's an awful thing, but I don't think it's productive. I don't think it's productive, and I don't think it's generous, and I think it's almost hypocritical to say, well, I bet there's all these other people who think the same. I happen to think Canada is the least anti-Semitic country on the face of the earth, including Israel. I've lived here as a Jew and as a journalist for many years, and I can say that when I started in journalism 20 years ago, I'd get lots of email from people like, oh, I see your last name is Hillel. Are you going to be covering the banking sector? Like, I mean, that was not an uncommon thing to happen. Right. It never happens to me anymore. And even on Twitter, I will get people come to me with all kinds of nonsense. The Jewish thing, actually, like when people DM me, trolls DM me, that's when like their true hatreds come out. It's very rarely about the Jew thing, even though I have the Jew thing in my Twitter bio, even though I'm a lapsed Jew and I eat bacon.
Yeah, look,
so
I don't believe in God, but I'm proudly Jewish. To me, those are not mutually exclusive
I don't think
things.
we live in an anti-Semitic country, and I don't think our Muslim population is especially anti-Semitic. And even if it were, as long as anti-Semites keep it to themselves. The problem with Laith Marouf was that he was a government contractor.
Okay, so I get that, and we'll agree to disagree on a couple of those notions, but let me ask you about him specifically. Okay. Ahmed Hussein came out the other day, and I thought wrote a very compelling statement. I thought it hit the right marks. I give him credit for it. Who else, because you say he doesn't reflect this, that, and if he does, that's their business, not mine. Okay, fine. In what we call, and I think it's all a grift, John, full disclosure, you can disagree with me. I think it's all a grift. Okay.
The anti-racism?
Yes. Yeah. I think it's all a grift. You don't have to agree with me.
99% a grift.
Okay. So then we have common ground. Yeah. In that community, which makes people millions and millions of dollars, it literally runs the universities and college campuses of this country, as well as every campus south of the border. In that community, and let's call it a community, we'll call it a community because when George Floyd was killed, that community spoke very loudly with one voice. When Ben Crump finds a microphone, they all speak with one voice, okay? When it comes to Laith Marouf and how public a story it is now that the Minister of Diversity and Housing put out in the anti-racism community, John, simple, straight question for you. Who have you seen come out and distance themselves from Laith Marouf publicly? Name one.
I got a DM. I got a direct message from a guy who's an anti-racism educator, and he said he wanted to disavow Laith Marouf, but he was afraid to do it because...
That's my point, John. So that's why you and I, look, we don't have enough time.
But that industry is a gift. That industry is a complete grift. And if there was money on the table for teaching people that 2 + 2 = 5, I absolutely guarantee that tomorrow they would teach people.
But my point is, if Erwin Kotler or Bernie Farber came out and said the equivalent to the other side of what Laith Marouf did, you would have CBC's The National, CTV National News, Global News, Chorus, Sirius. Every single segment of every single moment would be that community coming out and calling out Erwin Kotler, Bernie Farber, or you. And today, other than Ahmed Hussein, which I say he did the right thing, John, I am saying that to you, I have seen an absolute deafening silence that is of a like that you would never see If Jon Kay, I don't mean little Jon Kay, you know what I mean, I'm little Ari Goldkind. If Jon Kay or somebody equivalent to that said the opposite on the other side, sort of yin for yang, to what Laith Marouf does. And I think that's very telling. And it goes beyond it being just a grift, but to something a bit more pernicious in the very institutions that create discourse, create ideology, and create policy. Feel free to disagree.
Look, I take the view that the primary schism in our society right now isn't religious. It's political. And I think you place a strong focus, you said, well, what if people like Erwin Collar or Bernie Farber or you or me like said this and stuff? And to me, it's an interesting thought experiment. The more interesting thought experiment, or at least the more telling thought experiment, is like, what if Doug Ford or Stephen Harper, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, if they, under their auspices, under their watch, they had an anti-racism, they had paid $130,000 to a so-called anti-racism consultant,
yes,
who was just an out and proud anti-Semite and had been an out and proud anti-Semite for months and months and months. How would that have been reported? And the answer, of course, is it wouldn't have taken a week.
That's very interesting.
Because what would happen, but my answer to that is, the reason it wouldn't take a week is because you would have all of these media outlets,
yes,
and politicians, activists saying that this is a reveal that, look, by hiring this guy, you have revealed your secret anti-Semitic bigotry.
Yes.
Whereas if you look at the way the Canadian press reported this story a couple of days ago, because
they haven't.
Well, what they reported it in terms of the headline was,
it's the 30th after a car accident in Mississauga.
But they reported it as liberals act on, like, until the liberals were able to give a statement talking about how they were going to act. They didn't. So a week went by. So it's the equivalent the equivalent of reporting a car crash by waiting a week and say, government assures citizens of
they're looking into it,
of stronger road safety measures following this accident that happened a week ago. Like, but to me, that's a political phenomenon. It's not a religious phenomenon.
No. I think, when you were saying, let's do a thought experiment, I'm like, oh, I think you're quite right. And that is a very, very compelling thought experiment about how this would have been the only news of the day, sort of like Doug Ford swallowing the bee. So let me,
that was funny.
And I thought it was a real credit to him that he handled it like a pro. And as I said, totally separate from our discussion, this reveals why politicians with charisma will always beat politicians without. In any event, let me move back to what I said about Ahmed Hussein for just a moment. What did you make of the press release he put out? What did you make, or do you believe in your heart of hearts, that this man who was on the press release that's responsible for all of this, and then it's CMAC, the Canadian Media Advisory Committee, that Ahmed Hussein had no idea, the people who sent the money had no idea, everybody's got clean hands, and it's just Laith Marouf and his wife out on an island unto themselves, and nobody had a clue. What do you make of that? And do you think there is more to this story? Perhaps you don't, but I'm curious as to what you think based on your research.
So look, Brian Lilly has a column in the Toronto Sun that was published yesterday online. And he put the best possible gloss on this, where he said, well, there was sort of a changing of the guard in late 2021 in terms of cabinet responsibilities, and maybe it got lost in the shuffle and no one noticed it. Look, my speculation would be, of course, somebody noticed it, because Laith Marouf's anti-Semitism was out and proud on Twitter, and Pablo Rodriguez at Heritage, Hussein, his diversity portfolio. I mean, these guys are surrounded by like 25-year-olds who are just on Twitter 24/7. And so, of course, somebody saw it. My guess is somebody saw it after Hussein had stuck his name on a press release saying, yeah, this is the best thing since sliced bread, and Laith Marouf is my man, and isn't it awesome that he's going to go around teaching everyone about anti-racism? And Hussein, his staff, he and Ahmed's staff and Pablo's staff at Heritage, and for all I know, even Trudeau himself, were like, oh my God, what the hell are we going to do? Let's just let this nutbag do his anti-racism seminars and hope that no one notices. But what happened is Mark Goldberg, the guy I talked about before, he did notice. And then I noticed Mark Goldberg noticing. And then I think there was probably just some panicky conference calls or Zoom meetings where people are saying, like, what the hell do we do? And also the Jewish community got involved. Like, this is another reason that I don't think the Liberal Party has any kind of strong anti-Jewish undercurrent. Is Jewish organizations like CJA, B'nai B'rith, like, they have a lot of currency with the Liberal Party. And my understanding is that CJA in particular got involved and said, look, you got to do something about this. This is garbage. And they have influence. And they're, I mean, look, CJA's account is always, they're going to maybe slanted to in terms of emphasizing their influence, but I find it highly credible that a group like CJA took notice, called in their contacts in the Liberal Party and maybe the Canadian press, which wrote the first story on this. It was a very incomplete story, but at least it was a story. And so those developments are consistent with a grubby, cynical, ruthlessly self-interested Liberal political party, but not one that has any special animus, certainly, toward the Jews or anybody else. It's grubby politics where all they're thinking about is what's the spin on this. And the spin is terrible. The Liberals look awful.
You are much more optimistic than I am. I'm a pessimist, or perhaps a Debbie Downer when it comes to these issues, given my study of where things are going and where I think they'll be in 10 years. Jon Kay, I think at the end of the day, let me ask you a 10-second question before we wrap. 10 seconds. Would this, and I know you mentioned Mark Goldberg, but this is 10 seconds, John, then I'm going to play us in. If you didn't talk about this, would we be talking about this today?
Probably not.
Very good. And that's why I think no matter what you think, no matter what you and I disagree with, ultimately, given the way Canada is going, I think it's a real credit. Jon Kay was our guest for the full hour, podcaster, writer, editor at Quillette. John, without you talking about this story, this man would have gotten away with it. He's laughing, and I don't get to say this a lot, all the way to the bank. And hopefully you've made the funds dry up a little bit and you've done some real good here, even though one never knows. If I say he's a feature, you say he's a bug, that's a conversation for a different day. John, great to have you on the Ari Goldkind Show on Sirius XM.
Well, thanks for having me on. You're very generous with your praise. I would just one last shout out to Mark Goldberg, who supplied me with all my research. So he's
yes, and in fairness, John, I'll say this right on air. If Mark would like to talk about this, I'm happy to have him on. I just know that you shed light on this, and I think it's to be commended. If you're listening to us live on the Ari Goldkind Show, the Bilal Vakani Hour coming up right after the show. If you're listening to us on the various repeats throughout the week on the Sirius Network, we appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. We'll be back with you next week.